So I just want to say a few words before we begin. The first is that this event is something of a collaboration between the Center on Constitutional Change and the Association for the Study of Ethnicity and Nationalism. The embryo of the event started as an idea to discuss the book co-edited by two of our presenters, Ryan Griffiths and Diego Muro, on the strategies of secession and counter-secession. So the idea was to hold this, what was supposed to be an ASIN event in the summer. That fell through. And when that happened, we decided to take it in this direction and hold it as an expanded event. So I want to say just a few things first about the panel and then about the panelists, to introduce the panelists in other words. There are really two primary motives behind having this sort of an event on this subject and at this particular time. So the first reason is scholarly, and it has to do with the state of the art in the academic study of secession. The subfield of the study of secession has progressed a lot for the past 2 decades in particular. It's expanded in scope, in depth, and systematicity relative to the preceding period. Now, most of the work that has emerged over the last 20 years has tended to look at structural long-term factors, either societal or individual, that account for various outcomes related to secession. What we know, I think, significantly less about are the specific aspects of the actual politics of secession, what we call, for the purposes of this panel, strategic and tactical aspects of secession. So in other words, we know less about the specific ways in which all sides to these secessionist disputes engage in the politics of secession in light of what they expect others around them to do. So that's the scholarly motive. The second motive has to do with politics, the current moment, and some organizational issues. Center on Constitutional Change obviously is located in Scotland, and the issue of independence is very much alive and back on the agenda here. Now, we don't know whether or not there's going to be a second referendum on independence in Scotland, but the question is certainly part of the current political debates in the context of Brexit and increasingly also the management of the pandemic. In addition to that, the Center on Constitutional Change itself has in the past produced work relevant to the issue of secession and will continue to do this. So it is only appropriate that we have, I believe, this kind of an event here and at this particular time. Now, a little bit about our lineup. I'll start in reverse order of our presentations. And I want to first begin by saying that I know all of these outstanding people. So first of all, they're outstanding scholars, but they're really, really wonderful people whom I haven't seen in person in far too long. But I'm very, very happy to see them and to welcome to this virtual space. So first, I want to welcome Kathleen Gallagher Cunningham, who is Associate Professor at the University of Maryland. Kathleen works in part on issues of self-determination and secession. This includes her excellent book, Inside the Politics of Self-Determination. She also works on matters of political violence, civil war, rebellion, and all of this in a broadly comparative perspective. She's involved and leads a number of data projects, among which I want to emphasize the Strategies of Resistance data project, about which I believe we may hear today, but I don't want to guarantee anything. That's up to her to decide. I also want to welcome Anwen Elias, who's a reader in politics at Aberystwyth University in Wales. Anwen's research is on territorial politics and national identity, with focus largely on Western Europe, but with an eye on a number of other regions around the world. She's the principal investigator on a European Commission's Horizon 2020 project, Imagine, which deals with aspects of spatial justice and territorial inequalities in Europe. And she's also a co-convener along with Paul Anderson, who's joined us, and myself, of the OASIS Research Network on Territorial Politics in Times of Crisis. Now, we came up with that title before the pandemic hit. So I don't want to speak for the two of them, but I kind of feel responsible for the things that have been happening since then. Welcome also to Diego Muro, who is a senior lecturer of international relations at the Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence at the University of St. Andrews here in Scotland. Diego's work also spans a number of fields, many of them adjacent. But I got to know him first as an expert on terrorism and political violence, with particular focus on the Basque experience. Diego also works on the politics of nationalism more broadly, including on aspects of secessionist politics. And as I believe I mentioned, he's co-edited with Ryan Griffiths a volume on the strategies of secession and counter-secession that came out earlier this year. Finally, we have Ryan Griffiths, who is associate professor at Syracuse University's Maxwell School. Ryan has published very widely on the politics of secession along both its domestic and international lines. His relatively recent book, although he has another one coming up, his relatively recent book, Age of Secession, is, to my mind, one of the pivotal contributions to the debates. He's also heading the International Systems Dataset that looks to update dataset-driven research by including a number of political entities that were previously excluded from such work. And on that note, I'm going to hand it over to Ryan. Ryan, go ahead.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you for that great introduction, Karlo, and to the Center on Constitutional Change for having me here today. All right. I actually have a presentation. I'm just going to go ahead and share the screen. Right. So there's, as Karlo mentioned, my co-author and I, Diego, have a book that came out earlier this year. It's called Strategies of Secession and Counter-Secession. You can see the image right here on the left. It's an edited volume. And I'm basically in this talk going to sort of talk about the framework that we introduce in the book. And then when I hand it off to Diego, he'll talk about some of the chapters and some of the findings that we go through. I have another book coming out next year that takes a bit of a deeper dive on secessionist strategy. I'll mention that a little bit at the end of the talk. And in my mind, actually, the books almost sort of come together in many ways. So the topics bleed together. All right. So as Karlo said, look, this is a really interesting time to be studying the topic of secession. There's all the secessionist activity in recent years. Here's a cartoon about the Kurdish independence referendum back in 2017, September 25th, which many thought was kind of a bad move, a bad tactical move on behalf of the Iraqi Kurds. A week later, of course, we had a similar event in Catalonia. Obviously, plenty of secessionist activity in Catalonia in recent years. On October 1st, 2017, a referendum was held there. Like the Kurdish one, it was not government sanctioned, regarded by the state as illegal. And some observers wondered if maybe they had overreached. Maybe this was a case of bad strategy. And of course, there are other instances in recent years of referenda. Maybe some of you spotted the Scottish referendum back in 2014. More recently, New Caledonia, a French protectorate in the South Pacific, has been having a series of government-sanctioned referenda, where the no vote won by 56% in 2018. Just a couple weeks ago, they had the second referendum, a bit closer this time. The no vote only won by 3 percentage points. And they're supposed to have another one in 2 years' time. At the end of last year, Bougainville had a referendum. Bougainville is a breakaway territory within Papua New Guinea, a sanctioned vote that had been planned for 20 years, where 98% of the voters chose independence, likely to become the next sovereign state. So this leads to the general organizing question in the book, which is, how does a breakaway region become an internationally recognized sovereign state? What is the strategy of secession? How do we make sense of the different tactics that we see across the array of secessionist movements out there? And then, of course, how do home states respond to this? What are the strategies that they use to counter these efforts? Okay. And in the book, we think of this as a strategic playing field. We try to model it in that way, where we think of two types of actors. You have sovereign states, roughly 195 of them. These are the full United Nations members. And then, of course, secessionist movements. These are groups, roughly 60 of them right now, depends on how you count, that are organized to seek independence, usually by declaring, making some sort of declaration of independence, or by forming some sort of political party. And their goal, of course, is to become, a fully recognized sovereign state. And there are rules of the game. We talk about them at length in the book, and I talk about them at greater length in the book that's coming out. But informal rules and practices that shape how all of this plays out, including an application process that that secessionist movements go through to try to become an independent state. Now, this diagram here presents a schemata. This is what we have. We have this in the introductory chapter to the book. And what it does is try to give you a visual understanding of what we think of as the strategic playing field, where you have independence movements depicted on the upper left. They're trying to secede, and their ultimate goal is to become a recognized state, internationally recognized state. Now, the chief obstacle in that endeavor is their home state, right? The parent state. This is the UK for Scotland, Spain for Catalonia, etc. And this is the chief obstacle because international law assigns a great deal of weight to that home state, all right? Sometimes this is referred to as the home state veto. Now, where that home state is reticent or reluctant to negotiate or is keen to deny independence to the independence movements can go around the home state and try to bring in the international community to apply pressure on the home state. This happens all the time. This happened with South Sudan in 2011, or less commonly, to go around the home state, to do kind of an end run, if you will, and just recognize that independence movement. This happened to some extent with Kosovo, but of course they haven't gotten full recognition. So that's a difficult process. Now, most independence movements do all of these things, right? They have a go at the home state, and they also try to enlist the assistance of the international community. How do they do so? Well, what we do is we think of different types of tactics or types of behavior that independence movements use. Some are what we call, tactics of compellence, right? And here we're using the language of Thomas Schelling. To compel is to force change, to force an actor to change something, all right? And ultimately, that's what secessionist movements aim to do, which is to change the status quo, to change the state of affairs. And there are direct force tactics. Some of these are very institutional in nature, maybe capturing the Catalan parliament to get some sort of executive in office and begin the legislative process of trying to exit a state. All right, maybe by having a referendum, etc. Very democratic institutional process. And you see this in regions like Quebec and Scotland. Of course, there are extra institutional approaches that in many cases involve violence, right? Direct violent action against the home state to try to get what the secessionists want, or nonviolent civil resistance, which is, not using the institutional apparatus of the state, but also nonviolent and using tactics that are designed to try to curry sympathy and to try to generate greater support and, to some extent, shame the target into negotiating. Now, there's, of course, a different set of tactics that we think of as more rhetorical or normative in kind. We think of these as tactics of normative appeal, and this is where you're trying to change preferences. You're trying to change views on the issue at hand, and of course, the dominant normative appeal that movements make is an appeal to self-determination, and all groups make this appeal, right? That a nation should have the right to determine their political fate. But they make other movements, and some of these vary by the type. They make other types of appeals, and this varies a bit. In many cases, you see groups making an appeal to their ability to choose their political fate, usually by some sort of democratic process. The Catalans have made this appeal. In other cases, you see groups appealing to issues of human rights, usually because there are documented abuses at the hand of the state. These tend to, occur in more conflict settings, I think for obvious reasons. Another long-running normative appeal is about decolonization. You don't see this as much anymore, but you still do in some places, like West Papua, or Bougainville, or certainly New Caledonia, which is the argument that, look, given the principle of decolonization, we should be independent, but we're cut out of the process for various reasons. And then in other cases, you see groups making an appeal to what is sometimes called earned sovereignty. You see this in Nagorno-Karabakh, Northern Cyprus, Abkhazia. Basically, look, we function like a state. We have all the trappings of a state, the standards, and so we should be awarded the status of a state. All right. Now, there are other normative appeals, but these are some of the dominant ones that we talk about. Now, of course, set against this is the strategy that states use to try to counter all of this. All right. And in our view, this is a slightly newer area. It's less explored, but I think there's a lot of great research coming out on it. All right. So for states, there are different types of tactics or approaches they take to countering secessionist movements. One is, again, to make various rhetorical appeals. These usually have to do with stressing the preservation of order. All right. In all of these cases, we usually find a state that appeals to its sovereignty, its territorial integrity, right? Saying, look, we're a sovereign state. This should be respected. You often see states making arguments about preventing contagion, right? That, look, if you let any independence movement go, what does this do for the stability of states? Secessionism is an inherently disruptive activity. Is this something that we really want to do? You often see states, particularly when there is some sort of sanctioned referendum, making arguments about functionality, about economic strength. The French did this with New Caledonia. Macron said, look, you're better off staying with France, right? And, in terms of economic viability, how well will you do on your own? Going back to the Scottish referendum years ago, you saw the British government trying to make these arguments about how the Scots will be better off sticking with the UK. All right. Now, of course, you also have counter tactics, which might be a bit more, direct. And these often are the mirror image of the tactics that secessionists use. Where secessionists are engaging in electoral competition or capture, you see the state trying to push back against that, to try to win the vote. All right, it's a very democratic competition. But in other settings, you often see states engaging in tactics of deterrence, basically threatening a group that, if you do something, you will be punished in various ways. These are usually more conflict type settings. In many cases, just suppressing the movement. Where the state is particularly strong, there you often see efforts at suppression, and sometimes just direct forms of combat. And you can see how, again, the counter-secession strategies often mirror the strategies of the secessionists themselves. And then finally, international statements. Most parent states make some sort of international statement about their position, usually denying the right of that particular nation to independence. But in some cases, we find that the states can be quite silent because they don't want to draw attention to the particular case. So that kind of gives you a general layout of what we're doing in the book. We're thinking through the strategic playing field of secessionists and the counter-secession activities of the state. And then what we do in the book is we have two sections. We have the first part is a theoretical and conceptual analysis, and we have a series of chapters here that talk about declarations of independence, whether or not remedial secession is effective, parent state strategies, etc. And you can see them there. We even have one that looks at the sort of the legal strategies that states use to combat secessionist activity. And then in part two of the book, we engage in empirical case studies that will look at specific cases in Quebec and Catalonia, Flanders, etc., as well as maybe looking more along functional lines. We have a great chapter by Karlo that looks at the role of business actors in trying to shaping secessionist outcomes. So that is the general book. I'll leave it to Diego to say a bit more about some specific chapters. But finally, let me just do a quick plug for a book that I have coming out that sort of builds on a lot of this this material here. This is Secession and the Sovereignty Game, Strategy and Tactics for Aspiring Nations. It's coming out next year. And in this book, I do a historical and theoretical analysis of the sovereignty game, as well as case studies and fieldwork on a set of independence-seeking regions: Catalonia, the Muro Republic in Australia, West Papua, Bougainville, New Caledonia, and Northern Cyprus. There's a large end study in it. And then finally, an examination of mistakes and bad strategies that we see, that we see occurring in different secessionist cases. So that is my talk there. Let me bring it back, and thank you.
So it's sort of a handbook for secessionists, as it were. I'm very much looking forward to reading it. Diego, take it away, please.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to those of you who are in the US. Thanks to the Center for the Constitutional Change and ASIN, an organization I used to be part of a long time ago, and Karlo in particular for organizing this event. It's a pleasure to be here with such great company in the panel, but also in the audience. I know several of the people who are attending. Now, Ryan has provided an excellent introduction of the framework we set up in the introduction and the conclusion to the book. Most of the chapters follow the model, the idea of the playing field. Not all of them. And what I'm going to do now is I'm trying to mention some themes, up to 3 themes, while referencing some of the empirical contributions of the book, assuming you have not read the book, and you might not even read it, bearing in mind that it's difficult to access libraries these days, and we know the price of books. But I still assume that you would be interested to know what we deal with in that edited volume. So let me have a look at my notes. So what I want to do is essentially deal with 3 themes. I want to first mention the actions of counter-secessionists, then the idea of effectiveness, and finally the distinction between tactics and strategy. So counter-secession, effectiveness, tactic, and strategy. Now, the first issue of counter-secession has to do with the fact that when Brian and I were putting together the volume, I can see now he's putting back his burgundy colors, which is our team's colors. We found it a lot easier to find scholars that were working on the causes, on the tactics, on the strategies of secessionists, on how movements expand, on how political parties grow their support base. But we found it much harder to find scholars that were working on counter-secession, right? So what we wanted to do in the book was try to put these two together and in relationship to each other. And this is important because if you think about it, the outcome of any pro-independence campaign is essentially the result of the collision of 2 leading forces, the secessionist and the counter-secessionist. And we cannot ignore any of the 2 if we want to understand what's happening within this collision. If you like, we're talking about 2 sides of the same coin, and it becomes essential to combine both sides if we want to have a comprehensive view. That's what we were trying to do with the edited volume. I'm not sure if we managed, but we certainly aimed at exactly doing that. Now, I'll make reference to some of the chapters that actually deal with counter-secession. But before that, let me say that in principle, states oppose secession for a variety of reasons. James Kerlindsey has mentioned this in one of his excellent pieces. It's either because of national pride, economic interest, religious or cultural symbolism, the fear of a cascade of secessions, which Ryan mentioned a while ago. Essentially, all these reasons boil down to the fact that states see secession as a way of losing power, or losing relative power, if you like. Now, within the book, there are a few chapters that tackle directly the idea of counter-secession. Karlo has his great chapter on the role of big businesses and business organizations and how they voice economic concerns at the potential cost of secession, and how this voice is attacked, criticized, and sometimes suppressed by counter-secessionists, and in particular secessionists. There's another chapter that I really enjoyed, which is the one on legal instruments by Rivka. And she explains, or she details, two of the tools that governments and states use to prevent secession. The first one of them is the banning of secessionist party from competing in elections. And the second one is how some states entrench, or if you like, they codify the idea of territorial integrity in their constitutions and make it very difficult to reform. And she talks about the so-called eternity clause in her piece. Of course, the reactions from states will vary depending on the context, and we can, at the very least, distinguish between societies, post-conflict societies, and advanced liberal democracies, where we would expect different responses. And if we talk about particular cases in Europe, we have a different scenario, right? Or a different environment in which, for example, war has been completely removed as an option of resolving territorial disputes, which is something that we can find in other settings. Now, this leads me to the second point I want to mention today. That's the idea of effectiveness. And the reason why I mentioned this is that effectiveness has been discussed and used in the fields of course, public policy. You cannot evaluate a public policy unless you know what the goals are and whether the goals have been fulfilled or not. In the field of civil wars and in the field of terrorism, where I've written a bit about the idea of effectiveness of terrorism. And essentially, we will assume that a tactic or strategy, and I will come to the distinction between these two later on, a tactic or strategy is effective when it delivers the expected goals, right? And it's going to be very important to know what the goals are, which are not always explicit. And that, in a way, is the problem, one of the problems we have in evaluating effectiveness. There are a couple of chapters in the book that I think deal directly with the issue of effectiveness. We have the chapter by Argido Kartsunaki, and she examines a series of unilateral declarations of independence and tries to see whether the content of those UDIs, in particular, whether they make reference to remedial right or remedial secession, has an impact on UN membership. If I understood correctly, she concludes that there's no correlation, and I would assume that this means that having this sort of content in the UDI does not assure effectiveness, or the fact that the country or the new entity is going to be effectively recognized by either the host state or the international community. There's another interesting chapter I would recommend you guys read if you have a chance, which is the chapter by Sasha Pavkovic. And he discusses two unilateral declarations of independence in Pakistan and Kosovo. And again, the issue of effectiveness comes to the surface because in the case of Bangladesh, even though both host states, Serbia and Pakistan, opposed secession with arms, eventually Bangladesh was recognized by the host state. Kosovo was not, even though both eventually got some form of international recognition. So it's easy to make the point that Bangladesh is a successful case and Kosovo is not, but you cannot do this unless you unpack what effectiveness means, right? And just looking at the end goal without taking into account the short-term goals that take place on the ground and whether a cascade of recognition followed after the US and the fact that Kosovo eventually became an international protectorate where NATO and the UN had an important role to play in the forming and the survival of the country is essential. So once again, I think some of these chapters deal with is the idea of effectiveness, the idea of whether tactics or strategy deliver what they are supposed to deliver. And this finally connects with my last point, which is the idea of tactics and strategy. Once again, in the introduction, we distinguish between these two. The reason why we examine tactics and strategy, whether we make it implicit or explicit or not, is that we want to know whether these tactics work or do not work. For example, in the case of secessionists, what sort of arguments are more convincing? The ones that list all the specific harms and injustices that the host state has committed against the nation and the state to be, or appeal to general principles? What about UDIs? Is it better to unilaterally declare independence, or is it always better to come up with some form of agreement? And the last point, which I guess will be discussed later on, what about violence? Is it true that non-violent means are always more effective, or could it be that in very specific instances, violence is the only way? After all, we're interested in these questions because we want to know whether they deliver what their proponents expect to deliver. Anyway, coming back to the point between tactics and strategy, if you share corridors with people that work on security and strategic studies like I do, telling them what tactics and strategies are, is a bit of an offense. And of course, Clausewitz is there, and on war is their favorite book. But most of you will know that for Clausewitz, the use of the military combat is what he refers to as tactics, whereas the use of combats to win a war would be what we call strategy. Right? In peacetime, if you like, we could argue that tactics would refer to the use of resources in a particular confrontation between secessionists and counter-secessionists, whereas strategy would refer to the use of confrontations to obtain a long-term goal. And I want to just mention one example, which is not mentioned in the book, and this is in a way my own interest and research coming into the picture, which is the Catalan case, right? And I'm bringing this one up, and I'm very happy to be to talk about this later on, to see the difference and the importance in distinguishing between tactical and strategic effectiveness, right? As you know, Catalonia engaged in a claim for independence between 2010 and 2017, and this culminated in 2017 in a referendum organized by the regional government, which was deemed unconstitutional by the Constitutional Court of Spain. The 43% of the electorate went and voted on the 1st of October 2017, and of those 33%, 93% were in favor of independence. What happened in the following weeks was that the regional government either misread the results or was forced, there was a certain inertia that pushed them to declare independence unilaterally in the Catalan parliament at the end of October 2017. Independence was declared, and 57 seconds later it was suspended, and the regional prime minister asked the Spanish government to engage in new negotiations. The response from the state was to use an article from the Constitution that allowed the government to suspend autonomy, dissolve parliament, dismiss the executive, and take control of autonomy for 2 months until the new elections took place at the end of December. So for counter-secessionists, they would argue that this was a clear case of ineffectiveness. The idea of the Catalan Republic was always a dream, was always something that could not be realized. But from the point of view of secessionists, the UDI, the referendum, were used as tactics to force the Spanish government to sit down and negotiate a binding referendum, something that did not happen. So from our point of view, we could argue that the case of the referendum and the UDI in the Catalan case is one of a tactical and a strategic failure. And this would be a good contrast to the Scottish case, where we have a clear example of a tactical success and, for the time being, a strategic failure, in the sense that Scottish independence is not here yet, but once the door has been opened for a referendum, this is a very difficult door to close. So there may be another referendum, and that possibility, that strategic success, is still possible. Now, in terms of tactical gains or effectiveness of what the Catalan secessionists did in 2017, and I have many more gains for the whole period, but at the very least for 2017, would be the ugly scenes of police in riot gear, beating voters from all ages, and of course the harsh punishment that politicians have received in Catalonia and for which they are still in prison. In spite of these gains, the international community, the European Union, has not really changed its instance. and Spain has still effectively diffused for the time being the secessionist crisis. Now, just to conclude, I think that the book that Ryan and I have edited combines these three elements, counter-secession, effectiveness, and the distinction between tactics and strategy. We don't know what works and when it works, and I think this is something for us to do research in the next few years. But at the very least, I want to end by saying that we cannot understand pro-independence politics unless we pay some close attention to both the politics or the strategies and tactics of secession and counter-secession. Thank you.
Seconded. Thank you very much, Diego. Anwen, are you around?
I'm here. Hi.
All right. Hi. All right. It's on to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the invitation to join the discussion. I'm going to pick up on several of the points and themes raised by Ryan and Diego, but I'm going to do so from a very different starting point in that I don't have any complete research to report on. I don't have any exciting findings to talk to you about, so apologies at the outset. Rather, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk, as someone who's quite new to the literature on secession, as Karlo mentioned at the beginning, I come from a background of territorial politics. I've become interested in secession as some of the parties that I've been studying for a long time have either become secessionists, like Plaid Cymru here in Wales, like the former Convergència i Unió Catalunya, or parties that have always been secessionists, but secession has become much of a more prominent issue, like the case of the SNP. So my interest in secession has come as a result of following these parties. And what I'd like to do is share with you some very preliminary reflections on the secession literature, with the aim, by the end, if I can, of setting out a new research direction when we think about strategies of secession and counter-secession, and the kind of work that I would like to do over the coming few years. So these are very much ideas in development. But my starting point really is the very general observation that the scholarship on secession, which has increasingly focused on strategy in recent years, has really been led by scholars coming from mainstream political science and international relations perspectives. And it has typically conceived of this secessionist strategic playing field, to use Ryan's terminology there, as first of all consisting of two main types of political actors, so secessionists and states, operating in two distinct political domains, the domestic and the international arena. And from this conceptual starting point, secession is generally understood in this mainstream literature as quite a linear process with two distinct phases. So firstly, in the domestic arena, you have secessionists mobilizing, and the host state is compelled to respond to their claims. And then in the international arena, external states decide whether or not to recognize a seceding territory as a new state. And from this perspective, the literature, it seems to me, is focused on understanding the strategic choices of one type of political actor in relation to one of these phases of the secession process. So, for example, in the domestic arena, there is work that has tried to explain under what circumstances groups decide to mobilize for secession, or why a host state decides to accept or reject such secessionist demands. And then other studies focusing on the international arena have tried to explain under what circumstances demands for or attempts at secession are recognized by the international community. Now, whatever the exact focus, the general assumption in this literature is that actors' interests are determined by the domestic or international context in which they operate. And explanations of strategic decision-making in the main have been advanced on the basis of macro level, often large N, quantitative analyses of the structural features of actors' operating environments and how these structural features have a causal effect on specific strategic choices of interest. So that's my general resume, as I see it, of the literature on secession, what I'm going to call the mainstream literature on secession. But there is another literature on secession which is developed largely separately from and with limited reference to this mainstream scholarship. It's a literature that also focuses on strategic dimensions of secession processes, but it's done so through micro-level analyses of specific actors and how they engage with secession. It's quite a fragmented literature in the sense that it encompasses work by scholars from different disciplines, working quite separately from each other, and usually on the basis of in-depth case studies of secession in specific parts of the world. But nevertheless, I think it's quite an important literature because it gives us a different account of this strategic dimension to secession in terms of, firstly, the nature of the secessionist strategic playing field, that is, who the key actors are and the context in which they operate. And secondly, then the kinds of strategies that actors use to achieve or impede a territory's independence from the state. And what I'd like to do is to highlight three ways in which I think this micro-focused scholarship advances our understanding of strategies of secession, but also how this scholarship is also still limited in important ways. And by doing that, what I'll try to do is sketch out a different approach to conceptualizing and exploring the strategic dimension of secession. And again, as the basis of a new program of research to be developed. So, firstly, this micro-focused scholarship has provided evidence, I think, that the range of actors implicated in secession is broader than is generally assumed by the mainstream literature. By far, the most attention has been paid to political actors, and the evidence here is that these actors are both more numerous and varied than is allowed for by the standard distinction in the mainstream literature between secessionists and states. Let me just give you a few examples. So in the domestic arena, for example, there's a lot of work that has documented the different organizational forms that secessionist mobilization can take: political parties, social movements, civil society organizations, interest coalitions, diaspora communities, armed groups, and so on. Work on ethnic conflict has also problematized the idea that the state is a unitary actor in secessionist contests, arguing that within the state, you often have competing interests that shape how central governments respond to secessionist demand within their territory. In the field of territorial politics, studies of counter-secession strategies point to the agency not just of central governments, but also other statewide political parties and interest organizations. And in the international arena, there is this growing literature, as has already been alluded to, around the international relations of secessionist actors, and especially of de facto states, that documents the effort of these actors to establish a presence at and intervene in the international domain in order to build support for independence. And again, it challenges this idea that it's only other sovereign states that matter when it comes to deciding on whether or not to recognize a seceding territory's demands for sovereign statehood. So in terms of the political actors implicated in secession processes, it seems to me that the strategic playing field is more plural and complex than the mainstream literature allows for. But there is also work that has flagged up the role of other non-political actors in secession processes. For example, a handful of communication studies scholars have pointed to the role of the media in shaping the context in which political elites debate and citizens express their preferences on secession. And some scholars have also argued that citizens are also really important in such processes in terms of supporting or opposing any secession attempt. And there is a growing scholarship that's begun to explore determinants of voters' preferences on secession. But these media and citizen preferences are generally neglected relative to the focus on political actors. And so we know much less about them and the role they play in contesting secession. And there's also really very little attention to how different political media and citizen perspectives come together to constitute and shape the contested politics of secession. So given the evidence that these are separately very important dimensions of secessionist politics, it seems to me that there is a case for integrating these dimensions into a single study of the contested politics of secession, because doing so would allow you to explore the ways in which these different political, media and citizen perspectives separately and reciprocally engage with and influence debates about secession in different contexts. Second point I want to make about this, what I'm calling the micro-focused literature on secession. It's clear from this literature that the presumption in the mainstream literature that secession as an issue is contested separately by different actors in domestic or international political arenas, and that these domains are discrete and separate from each other, that this has also been challenged. It doesn't stand up to empirical scrutiny. So I've mentioned just now the literature on the international relations of secessionist actors and the way in which these actors rarely confine their strategies to the domestic sphere. The host state has also been shown to operate at the interstices of domestic and international arenas, with central governments often opposing secession within their own territory, but working simultaneously in the international arena to block recognition of a territory that's declared unilaterally its desire to secede. And then recent work on the evolution of secessionist campaigns in Western and non-Western contexts has argued that in plurinational states, domestic politics actually consists of two distinct territorial arenas, the state and the sub-state levels. And that these arenas are characterized by distinct actors, different political dynamics, and that this critically impacts on how processes of secession play out in practice. So there's evidence that secession plays out across multiple territorial levels simultaneously. The sub-state nation, the plurinational state, and the broader international arena. But scholars haven't yet integrated the study of these different territorial levels into their analyses, in the sense of exploring how different political and media actors located in, but often operating across different territorial arenas, engage strategically with secession, and how citizens in sub-state nations make sense of such strategies. And arguably, without taking this kind of multi-level understanding of the strategic playing field into account, we miss out on a crucial dimension of secession processes as they happen in practice. Third point I want to make is that this micro-focused literature has shown us that explanatory accounts of secession that only consider the causal effects of structural factors fail to account for the highly variable nature of secessionist dynamics in practice. Instead, scholars, often coming from constructivist perspectives, have argued that what matters is rather how actors implicated in secession make sense of the context in which they operate and construct their strategic interests on the basis of subjective understandings of their operating environments. Now, from this perspective, the main focus has been on exploring political actors' meaning making through the discursive strategies, the kind of rhetorical appeals that Ryan was talking about. And specifically, there's work that has examined how different actors have framed and counter-framed the necessity and the potential costs and benefits of independence. Most attention has been paid to secessionist parties and movements, and this work has evidenced the varied ways in which parties have drawn on political, economic, and to a much lesser extent, cultural arguments to make the case for independence. But other work has also looked at how central governments have tried to discredit secessionist movements through their rhetorical strategies, how external states have interpreted secessionist conflict in their foreign policies, the policy approaches of international organizations such as the EU, and how this affects their attitudes towards state recognition, as well as studies how sub-state, state and international news media have covered secessionist campaigns, and again, how this matters for setting the context for political debates on secession. Other scholars have focused instead on tactics and action strategies, flagging this up as an important determinant of the trajectory of secessionist contestation in many cases. So there's a lot of interesting work here. The problem is that the work in terms of its empirical focus is quite uneven. It's mostly focused on discursive strategies and of secessionist groups in particular. As both Ryan and Diego were alluding to, we know much less about counter-secession strategies. We know very little or relatively little about the action repertoires, the tactics of for and against secession. And probably most importantly, the literature also fails to provide a comprehensive account of why it is actors contest secession as they do. So not only what strategies do they use, but why do they choose those strategies and not others? And here the contrast with the macro-focused literature is quite stark, where the understanding of the contextual influences on strategic preferences is at the centre of analysis. So it seems to me that in order to better understand the specific discursive and action strategies that different actors use to contest secession, there is this need to integrate micro-level analyses of how political and media actors, as well as citizens, talk about secession, about how political actors mobilise for and against independence, with macro-level analyses aimed at explaining these strategic choices as a function of the broader multi-level contexts within which actors operate. So let me try and quickly come to a close by summarising where I've come to in terms of my view of this literature and its strengths and its weaknesses. What I'm pitching, I guess, is a research agenda that starts from a different conceptualization of secession in terms of who its key actors are and the context in which they operate, and one that foregrounds the strategic agency of a range of actors in multi-level political context. So I'm talking here about political and media actors located at the sub-state, state and international scales, and citizens in sub-state nations where claims for secession are salient. And from this alternative starting point, I think a different set of research questions arise in relation to the strategic dimension of secession, such as how does the contested politics of secession play out in multi-actor, multi-level political contexts, and why? What are the different discursive and action strategies used for and against secession, and again, why? And then, importantly, how do such dynamics impact on the outcome of secessionist campaigns and on politics and society more broadly in the places where secession is contested? And it seems to me that these questions direct attention to neglected but potentially very important determinants of secessionist processes. That is how and why different actors in different political arenas simultaneously engage with secession through their discourses and actions, and the interconnectedness of these strategies in shaping the contested politics of secession and its outcomes. Practically, what does this mean in terms of doing research? Well, what I'm suggesting is a research direction that applies this conceptual framework to an in-depth study of recent independence referendums. I'm particularly interested in discursive strategies of different actors at different territorial levels of analysis. So political and media actors, as well as citizens in sub-state nations. And by focusing in on independence referendum campaigns, asking some of these broader research questions in a more specific way. So how do political and media actors frame and counter-frame independence? And how do citizens make sense of these discourses? And how do these discourses intersect to shape the politics of secession and its outcomes, both in terms of the outcome of the referendum itself, but also, and specifically when the referendum doesn't lead to the creation of a new state, what are the impacts on politics and society that may ensue as a result of that referendum process? And to ask these questions in this way in order to get a more holistic, bigger picture understanding of the discursive contestation of secession. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Anwen, very much. And Kathleen?
Thanks so much, Karlo, for inviting me and for the Center for just having this fantastic discussion. I have been taking notes during it for thinking about my future work on this topic. And, so far, I think this has been a really fantastic discussion for everyone. The nice thing about going last is that I get to pick up on all of the wonderful things that you've said, and either say why I disagree with you and have the last word, or why I agree with you. But let me go ahead and start with what I've had prepared, and I'll sort of intersperse comments along on some of the other things that have been said. So when Karlo asked us to do this, he gave us two guiding questions that I'm going to orient around here. One was, what do you see as the most exciting part of your research as it relates to this? Which I love the framing of that question, because I really do find this work to be some of the most exciting things going on in contentious politics work, and particularly in the area that I focus more on, self-determination and rebel governance at this point. And then the second question is really about future directions. So I'm going to talk, hopefully somewhat briefly, although I am enthusiastic about my own work, about what I have done in this field and why I think it matters. This is something that is, I think, an essential academic skill, is to, of course, say exactly what we think is fantastic about our own work, but I'll try not to dive too heavily into it. So let me start by saying that most of my work doesn't talk about secession in the terms that are talked about here. Instead, I typically talk about self-determination movements. And there is a reason for this that relates quite a bit to what Anwen was talking about, which is sort of how do we conceptualize these struggles? And for me, the thought process in starting with the subject of self-determination rather than secession is because I view getting to the point of secessionist claims and activity as sort of part of a continuum of self-determination. And I think that the Scottish case is a great example of this. This was the subject of my college honors thesis, which I wrote in 1999. And this is just after the second referendum on autonomy, where they got their own legislature. And so I had this real fascination with a number of things that continued throughout my work for the next 20 years, which is, why did they vote no the first time? Why did they vote yes the second time? How do we then end up later, of course, at an independence referendum and have a no vote on that? And so it's the intersection of these strategic processes that Ryan and Diego are talking a lot about between the government and the SNP, but also, as Anwen brought up, the underlying preferences of the population, all these actors that get a chance to vote, or get a chance to participate in some way. And so for my work, I typically talk about self-determination because I want to cast a wide net on all of these movements that are seeking greater self-rule, whether that looks like political autonomy, whether that looks like cultural autonomy. They want to bring the center of choice down closer to their group identity. So if you are familiar with my work, I'm sure you already know this. If you're not, then I would say this is one of the big distinctions between the work that I do and the work that Karlo and Ryan and Diego and others do, is to sort of step back in that political process. I think my most important contribution to this literature was my 2014 book on self-determination politics. And the gist of this also aligns with quite a bit of what Anwen said, which is that these movements are fragmented. They're not unitary. They don't have solitary political organizations that represent them. They don't necessarily even have consistent preferences across the group or over time. And so that book really focuses on the role that fragmentation that underpins these movements plays in how governments treat them. So it's the intersection of these fragmented movements, their quest for greater self-rule, and when governments choose to fight them, when they choose to accommodate them. Some of the things that continue for me to resonate even after that project is completed, and as I continue work on the topic, is what I would call the internal uncertainty within these groups. And I think that for me, this is I think one of the real challenges as an analyst outside of these movements, now my work is primarily quantitative. I look at lots of different cases at one time. And in doing so, we typically make assumptions about the nature of the actors and what they want. I think not only do we not know for sure as analysts what these actors want, I think it's unclear to people on the ground what there's support for. And that you do have these surprise referendums and these surprise outcomes where leaders of a movement anticipate one kind of mobilization, but they get another. And to me, this is just fascinating. And I'll return to this in the future directions. In terms of the work, theoretically, my big goal with that project was to challenge this unitary actor assumption that Anwen also brought up. And I think that this continues to be an important point for quantitative scholarship, particularly because it takes a lot of investment and a lot of time. As many of you know, I know especially Ryan, who's done original data collection on this, it takes a huge investment to create new data to assess these political processes. And so there's a real impetus and I think sort of motivation to stick with where we have been, right? Which is to look at unitary actors as groups, unitary actors as countries, and that this is something that I think my work and I think Ryan's work and then the work we see in Diego and Ryan's edited volume really pushes forward on, right? This disaggregation and this effort to rethink who the relevant actors are and their relationship to one another. In moving forward with that, I think that our future work, although I'm not to my future section yet, still talking about my own work, I do think in the future, this has been done more and more on a political aggregation because we can see actors, right? They ask for things, they mobilize, they create political parties, they participate in votes. This disaggregation of preferences and means, though, I think is less clear so far. So this is going to bring me to talk a little bit about the data contribution, which Karlo mentioned. The follow-on to that big fragmentation project has been the Strategies of Resistance data project. And what that project has done is taken essentially all of the organizations that I identified as these fragmented parts of movements and asked the question, well, what are they doing? I knew from doing the original project, some of them are political parties, some of them are rebel groups, some of them are these civil society actors that don't fit into any of the categories that conflict scholars look at. And so this project took on that list as a starting point and over a course of years identified a bunch of nonviolent and violent behaviors that were done by these organizations. And so what we created was an organization year data set spanning originally 45 years, asking, did this specific organization engage in an economic boycott this year? Did they do a hunger strike this year? So we have a range of nonviolent behaviors, which to me was sort of where my interests were starting to transition, as well as the traditional indicators of violence. Were they attacking the state? Were they attacking civilians? Was there infighting inside the movement between organizations? I'm really happy to announce that we are expanding that data. I have research assistants finishing the 2016 to 2020 set now, but we already are up to 2016. So that's going to be released shortly. So we'll have a large set of data that I think is going to be even more useful post, the Cold War, right? So we have a lot of changes in geopolitics. We have a lot of changes in information availability. So we're going to be adding a lot of data there that I think will be interesting to social scientists. If you're interested in knowing more about that project, there is a data paper out at Journal of Peace Research about it. There's also a paper at American Journal of Political Science that's on the interdependence of tactical choice. So this gets a little bit to some of the dynamics that Anwen was talking about, and also Diego talking about tactics versus strategy. So it's a paper that analyzes whether organizations are more likely to use certain kinds of tactics based on what others are doing around them. So I think that's sort of a fun paper. And then there's an ongoing paper that I've been working on in this project that intersects almost exactly with what Diego was talking about in terms of efficacy. So one of the big questions that I had in starting this project on tactics was exactly this, does nonviolence work? So my inclination in sort of moving towards this project was, having spent 10 years of my life in data collection on organizations that seek secession or self-determination, I know most of them are not rebel groups. I know many of them are political parties, but other ones are organizations that don't do either of those things, right? Not conventional, not violent. And having looked at all of that information over time, my intuition was that there is a role being played by these nonviolent tactics, but we had never really quantified this the way that that would allow us to kind of assess this in a systematic way for a large set of cases. Part of the motivation was also doing some work with Erica Chenoweth on a special issue on nonviolence, and recognizing that for people who care about secession, the nonviolence literature just doesn't speak to them by and large. Most movements for secession don't use mass nonviolence. They never will enter into those kinds of data sets or studies. And so this project really takes it down to low-level nonviolent tactics, starting really with Gene Sharp's list of tactics. He had really a lot, for those of you that know Gene Sharp's work. So I got it down to 5 categories of tactics. I was not going to code 120, whatever it is. But then looking at those in a broad, systematic way. That project is still underway. I will say the initial results suggest that these movements that use nonviolent tactics are more effective. They are getting from the state more concessions than groups that are using violence. Now, violence is also effective in some situations. So I think it's important to note that unlike the Chenoweth and Steffen study, it's not a nonviolence works, violence doesn't work sort of story. But it is to say that separatist movements are using nonviolence. It does appear to be effective. Now, the argument that I make in that paper is really consistent with the logic that Ryan and Diego are presenting, and to some degree with Ryan's forthcoming work, which is that the international community is playing a role here that we need to pay attention to, right? That it's not just a dyadic story. And so I'll transition now to talking briefly about where I think the future work should go, where my work is going, where I'd like to see other people's work go. The first is this intersection of secessionist nationalist claims and human rights organizations and norms. And so this is sort of a subset of the things that Ryan looks at in his new book. But for me, this is really a fascinating dimension of nationalism and secession today, which is that we're seeing a shift, at least in the cases that I spend a lot of time with, from claim making about nationalism to claim making about human rights. And that this, given the current human rights context, or when I started working on this project 5 years ago, pre-Trump, the current human rights regime at that time, to me seemed like a useful and open sort of forum for these organizations to start activating claims against states and getting the kinds of interventions that they could potentially use. So linking, this work on tactics to naming and shaming, to the international human rights regimes, mechanisms of change. That's one area that I am moving in. And sort of, I think, is a really interesting place to go. Another area that I think resonates with some of Anwen's comments are about how decisions about tactical choices are made in a variety of contexts. So I really like the strategic logic framework. This it plays a role in a lot of my work. But my sense from doing work in this area is that there's really quite a lot of variation in how decisions get made by particular organizations within certain types of movements in different institutional contexts. So they face different constraints on communication, resources, all these things we know from the social movements literature. I would love to see work on how the decisions get made. And that I think would open up a big area for us to learn more. The other piece sort of related to this, I think, is the sort of resonance of these decisions with the public. So in my piece in AJPS from the Strategies of Resistance project, we make an argument that different tactics require different amounts of mobilization. So part of that tactical decision making is going to be about who you think you can get to get involved in your tactic, particularly when we talk about nonviolent tactics, although I think it also resonates for violent tactics. So one thing I would love to see, and I am starting to do a little bit of work on, is more survey work and public opinion work about how people think about these tactics and what they're willing to participate in. So I have a survey project I'm working on now about assessment of legitimacy of tactics in the context of the United States. And then I've done a little bit of work on that in a broader sense about how people, particularly Westerners, evaluate tactics by rebels that are nonviolent tactics. And I think there's, in thinking about the different methodologies that are used in this literature, I think this is a great place to move forward in. I will just say one more thing with respect to future directions here, and then I'm sure we have a lot of questions coming up. Everybody talked about referenda. Referenda, I think, are fascinating. This is sort of the start of Ryan's presentation. I would offer maybe an alternative way to think about referenda, or maybe it's something everyone here has thought about, but it's to think about referenda as strategic behavior, not as an outcome, and not as something that we just care about the impacts of. And so this is a way of thinking of it in a broad repertoire of tactics. So we think about violence, nonviolence, conventional politics. I think referenda, as we're seeing it today, really comes at an intersection of conventional and nonviolent tactics. So to run an illegal referenda, right? That's a strategic choice. That's a tactical choice that's being made, and it has implications that are different from a legal referenda. So there's a project I've been working on with Elias for the past 2 years, where we are looking at all the referenda on self-determination that have happened in the last 40 years, and trying to parse out what determines when groups use these referenda. Our initial findings suggest that the story is largely about internal politics, that referenda are done not just to seek goals with the state, but also to create advantage within the movement, right? To solidify power positions. And these are the kinds of dynamics that everyone is familiar with, but I don't really think that they've been considered as part of the process through which we get to and observe these public referenda, at which all of these things then come back into play. As Ryan and Diego say, the Counter-Secession movement, says Anwen is suggesting, all these other actors that can and do participate in the campaigns. And so I think this is an area where I think there's a lot of potential for greater understanding of the political process as well. So let me stop there and say thank you again, Karlo, and to all the panelists for this great discussion so far.
Well, thank you, everybody. So I was very, very, very glad and happy when all of you agreed to participate. I am even happier having heard you all. This is really, really wonderful.